19.
Oh, gross, gross, gross,
Middy exclaimed, covering her mouth and backing away from the now dead bird-like creature that Fast Joe had called an eye-bird.
I think I'm going to be sick.
Away into their journey to Misudo, a flock of the things happened upon them out of the mists and assailed them. The creatures were beyond disgusting, and it was hard to even believe a natural creature could evolve in such a way. Their bodies were like a great fleshy ball with small membranous wings. It seemed their only natural weapons were taloned feet, but the bulk of their bodies were covered in dozens of eyes, with 2 larger main eyes on stalks at the top of the body. Lastly, the hideous mouth was this great red gap right down the middle of their bulbous body. When it attacked, it opened its entire chest to reveal long teeth around its throat. If looking at it wasn't horrifying enough, the agitated shrieks it made were enough to send chills down your spine. Chesney stood above the dead bird thing and wiped the blood and eye fluids from his sword.
What? You don't want to try to cook it?
There was a heaving sound out beyond where he could see.
Gah! Don't even joke about that.
Chesney and Fast Joe collected the crystals from the bodies of the eye-birds, then left the bodies for the creatures of Sasquatch to take care of. It was a few minutes before Middy could even speak again without gagging.
The way the eyes popped, with the lightning. This is going to be a new nightmare. I know it,
she said, shaking her head.
She says it like she's the one who had one latch onto his whole head,
Chesney said, gesturing to Fast Joe.
By the way, how are you holding up after that?
Looking straight ahead with a wide, shell-shocked expression, Fast Joe replied,
I think I just lost a year off of my life.
The mist seemed to get thicker the closer they got to the town, to the point where beyond a dozen paces, it was too hard to see anything. Middy brought up the map again.
It's a good thing we have this, otherwise I'm sure we'd never find this place then. It's a shame about the mist in this valley. Actually, the trees in Misudo are said to be absolutely gorgeous. Full, tall trees with roots that hoist them even higher into the air, and lush purple leaves.
Once they finally arrived, they found that Fast Joe's knowledge was quite correct. Misudo was a lush place, in sharp contrast to the cold, ashy, dry grounds they'd seen thus far. Here, there was pale green grass everywhere, dotted with pink and blue flowers. Towering above everything were incredibly tall trees, some higher than the highest parapet of the magic school. The canopy was like a gently swaying, billowy cloud of purple. Combined with the deep mists, it gave the place a dreamlike quality. The trunks of the trees were wide, and incredibly tall. Some people had even built homes into the bases of some of the trees. They were so wide. The center of the town was overtaken by a huge pond, and as such the town itself seemed to grow up around it. Over the pond, though, was a long, arched bridge to more easily get to the other side.
Middy, Fast Joe,
Chesney whispered.
Put your hoods up. Maybe we can fool them with all this mist.
She did as he suggested.
What about you?
He tapped his helmet.
Nobody can see my head in this.
Quietly, they strolled through the gate. It wasn't long before a resident spotted them. They were a Fiorla, as evidenced by their dark green forehead plait.
Hello there, travelers. Welcome to Misudo. What brings you all the way out here? Oh, we were just on our way to visit the Temple of Zagos, but got a little lost. I don't suppose you know the best way to get there?
Chesney asked. As Chesney was talking, though, the face of the resident who spoke to them screwed up a.
Oh, you're from Nasquat, aren't you?
He sniffed the air.
Ugh, Nasquat for sure. Gross. Get out of here. This is no place for you.
Rather than get angry and start assembling a mob, though, the man just shook his head and stalked away disgustedly. Chesney threw up his hands and smelled himself.
Okay. Seriously, what is the deal with this whole smell thing? I don't smell anything at all. I mean, sure, we've been traveling for days, but anyone would smell like that.
Middy turned to Fast Joe.
Fast Joe, do people from Nasquat really smell different or something?
He winced.
Well, I mean, maybe Little different.
The pair crossed their arms and looked at him expectantly. Deflating. Fast Joe expanded.
Okay, fine. I don't know why, but for some reason people from Nazquat smell like wet goo-boo. That's the closest I can describe it. And it's that noticeable that people can pick up on it immediately.
Chesney asked. Fast Joe nodded.
Well, just fantastic. Come on, let's just go look around. Maybe we'll find some information anyway. And what are we going to do if another lynch mob starts to assemble?
Media whispered to him. He put on his most amused face, forgetting that nobody could see it with his mask on.
We'll show them how hard it is to pick on us.
He was tired of being pushed around and playing nice. He had a job to do, and if push came to shove, he was going to do it.
Chesney, master of diplomacy,
Media said, giggling quietly. It was nice to see her smile so much. Lately it had seemed like everything was getting so hard, but now that things were so much more out in the open, it had felt so much easier between them. Maybe my plan for us to just do things our way really was the right call, he thought. Seeing her be her natural self was so relaxing. It made it much easier to forget the ways his sword arm still sometimes felt like it was someone else's. They wandered about the town, trying to get into polite conversations to get the information they needed, but all they got for their trouble was glares and turned-up noses. They did manage to glean there was a rope network next to the town that would take them further east, but that people from Nazquat were banned. Chesney led them to a secluded part of town, then removed his helmet in frustration.
It's Barsis all over again. Why did we give up those clothes to Joanne? And better question, what do we do now? Why don't we just force our way into the rope network? It's not like they're heavily defended.
Fast Joe asked quietly. Media shook her head.
Bad idea. Assuming we could even get into a car. As soon as they get loose, or wake up, they could stop the rope at any time and we'd be stuck like fools, waiting for Zagos's forces to pick us up at their leisure.
They fell silent once more. From the mists, echoes of villagers talking and laughing, mixed with chirping birdsong, contrasted their dour moods. Chesney let his gaze lazily trace the outlines of the nearby homes and businesses. It really was a beautiful place. It was just a shame how incredibly unwelcoming the people here were. Still, they weren't being chased out of town either. It was then that he spied something familiar. A familiar silhouette in the hazy fog. But he had to be sure.
No way. No way.
He jogged closer to what he had seen, then called back.
Media, come here.
She raised an eyebrow, then strolled over to where he was.
What is it?
He gestured to her to look around. Nonplussed, she did, looking all around.
I have no idea what you're... Whoa.
She gasped.
Is that what I think it is? I think so.
He grinned. She squealed in joy and grabbed his hands, then jumped up and down excitedly.
Now, goodness me, what has gotten you two in such a state?
Fast Joe asked, wearing an expression that seemed to convey he thought they were adorable.
It's another spiritualist temple. And look, there's a symbol for a spirit we haven't seen before.
They walked up to the temple, also carved into the trunk of a massively wide and tall tree. Out front were two carved statues as symbols, on either side of the stairway. One was a triangle with a circle around it, and the other seemed like a beautifully carved tornado. Though they hadn't seen either symbol before, Chesney had a feeling that the triangle and circle symbol represented the spirit of Sky. He had gotten it in such an unorthodox way, back in Dubber with the machine. But looking at the symbol now, he had no doubts that was it. Sky was an oddly elusive spirit to come to understand, especially since the understanding he'd been given had been forced into his brain. There, but hidden. If spirits were beings that could speak, he had no doubt it would be in abstract concepts and not words. He felt a pang of guilt for not continuing to meditate on the nature of spirits, and how they interacted within him, like the previous temple had suggested. But now, this temple had a new spirit, air. and he was excited all over again to expand his power. Now, with 4 spirits, he had access to 10 spells: fire, freeze, break, lightning, great fire, blow up, heat, chain lightning, reflect magic, and defense down. With air, he would gain 5 more. He turned to Midia.
Hey, refresh me on the magic you have.
She twirled her hair while she thought it out.
Well, there's lightning, cure poison, freeze, and break, then heal confusion and paralysis, chain lightning, reflect magic, speed up, strength up, and defense down.
He nodded.
Right, so the differences between us are the spirits of fire and earth. That gives me fire, great fire, blow up, and heat, while you have cure poison, confusion and paralysis, speed up, and strength up.
Midia giggled excitedly.
Whoa, I can't wait to see what I can do next.
Fast Joe twirled his immaculate mustache.
My, you two are just filled with surprises. I don't think I've ever met anyone with as many spirits as you two. Nor as practiced. That kind of power is just incredible. And so young, too. I am very glad you're on the side of peace.
He had a point. What could someone do with all this power with evil intent? He looked back at the Fiorella, and thought about Zagos. He already had his answer. Stepping forward, Chesney pushed open the beautifully carved dark wood of the doors and entered the spiritualist temple. Once more, the thick, incense-choked air hit him like a wall. Inside, 2 spiritualist elders, dark green skin and purple robes like all the others, turned from their tasks to regard them. One turned back to his work at a book. The other smiled and approached.
Ah, I see I have fresh students after so long. Come, take off your packs, and sit with me.
They did as they were told and sat down with eager smiles. The master, noticing this, laughed.
Aha, such interested students. It is good to see. Tell me, young ones, which spirits do you have already?
They told him. He raised his eyebrows in shock.
Goodness, that's quite a lot. The truth is, while spiritualism was once quite popular on Lennis, over time the old ways have begun to die off. These days, very few people have even reached your level of mastery. It is good to see some of the youths of today taking an interest in such things.
His voice was full of nostalgia.
Now, close your eyes, breathe deep, and let us find the stillness within.
They did as they were told, and that familiar gravity seemed to hold them there. The smell of incense filled their lungs, and their minds felt like they were opening to something. Like standing at the door, waiting impatiently for a guest to arrive. Fire, sphere, die, and light. They were like tittering children within him, leaping about his mind. They could feel it too. Again, Chesney was struck with the odd feeling of knowing that the spirits were not in fact sentient things, but reflections of his understanding of the great universal laws or truths. But it still felt so alive to have them within him. Felt so natural that they combined themselves to form greater magic. But why did not 3 or more spirits act as one? It always felt like they should, but they couldn't. He still didn't understand. Like a trio of children who almost come up with a fun game, only to disagree on the rules and storm off. Hopefully, this new spirit would help him understand. The master spoke again.
Here you will come to understand the spirit of air. Air is not simply the air we breathe, it is the emptiness between as well. Focus on light. Feel the particles that make up the world. And then, notice the vast emptiness between them.
Never before had he been asked to view another spirit's domain from the perspective of another. It was a fascinating idea. He allowed the perception of light to fill him, and again to feel as though the world was simply a gigantic sandcastle waiting to fall away into dust. But this time, he did indeed shift his focus to pay attention to that gap. In the air, the gaps between particles seemed like vast chasms. But then he began to notice that even in the densest of objects, like stone, in truth, almost all of the space it took up was empty. Suddenly, it felt like if he shifted wrong, he would simply fall through the gaps in the world and disappear.
Yes, there. You are beginning to understand and feel it, young master. Am I supposed to feel like I'm about to fall through the floor?
Chesney asked, eyes still closed. Beside him, Medea agreed.
Yeah, it's suddenly very disconcerting. Very good. You are both at the threshold. Do not be afraid, for while this universe is now shown to you to be empty, it is also full of laws. Air governs how matter divides itself, and also how things travel. To go from here to there, air must be asked to part and make way. Now, focus. Your element. What do they desire with air?
Air. The space between all things. Fire would want only one thing. Let me through. Unending, unceasing fire. A fire unbound by distance, or resistance. Almost like the final permission fire needed to finally let everything burn. Everywhere, like it was always destined to. There it was. He could feel the spirit at the threshold of his being, holding out a hand. Let me in. And fire, demanding. Let me through. A part of him could feel how dangerous these two together would be. That, if he wished it, he could make a flame so great it would never stop consuming. How desperately both the spirits would desire to do just that. And so any time he would use these together, he would need absolute control. He scrunched his eyes together and extended that part of himself to allow air within. And all the spirits within would whoop and shout, and dance, and revel, and scream, "At last you're here." His body began to rise, and it was as though a flame passed from himself into the very roots of the universe, filling every gap with heat and consumption. It was then he became aware just how much the spirits seemed to interact within him now. How desperately they actually wanted something. They wanted to all be together, in so much as natural forces could want anything. But this felt powerfully real, like they fit together in ways he could not yet comprehend. The more he searched his own awareness, the more he could feel something within, like a puzzle that did not yet have all the pieces. In his awe at discovering something about the spirits, he could feel his control of the situation slipping, and he immediately snapped back and cut them off in their joy. This much is enough. Burn no more. And so the all-encompassing fire that would spread to the edges of the world stopped, and returned to him, and he gently returned to the floor. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Then, as he tried to catch his breath, he opened his eyes and looked over to Medea. She too was floating, though her eyes were open and all over her body were arcs of electricity. Part of him wanted to shout, to hold it all in, and take control. But he knew that she was an extremely talented spiritualist and didn't need his help. So, he watched. The electric field seemed to emanate from her in waves, and the whole room seemed to smell like ozone in moments. He was suddenly reminded of when she lost control in her anger, and a storm had collected above her, raining bolts of lightning down over the whole peninsula near Lagan. If she was unlocking that kind of power now, then, their power was becoming truly terrifying. In a few moments, the growing flow of power began to ebb away, and she too sank to the floor, gasping for breath.
Wow,
she said, between breaths.
It's like I could see everything, everywhere, and I wanted to fill all the cracks with power. It was really hard to stop.
He nodded.
Fire was much the same. Excellently done, young masters. Now, feel inside yourself. Discover the power you now possess.
The tumult within him was unlike anything he had felt before, like being tugged in so many directions at once. Still, he mastered himself enough to pick out the spirits within him one at a time, and feel what they could do together. Air's basic spell was escape, a short-range teleportation, probably the same one that Fastjo would have used to leave the Helm Temple if they'd had the time. Air with sky, that was warp, an even larger teleportation spell, one that could reach across huge distances. Air with sphere was magic wall, It could make all magic less effective against the user. Air and light was a massive lightning attack that could cover a huge area, much like he had unlocked with air and fire. There, all at once, he and Midia had become powerful enough to simultaneously devastate a huge area around them. What forces could reasonably have any chance of stopping them? The more he thought about it, the scarier the thought was, how anyone could have this much power. What were the Reagans thinking, bringing this power to Lennis? Midia gasped and looked at her fingers.
Incredible. Just incredible, Chesney. I feel practically invincible.
He hated to bring her down when she felt like this, but the concern was impossible to ignore.
That's kind of what I'm worried about. Like, don't you wonder what someone with bad intentions could do with all this?
She groaned and rolled her head back.
Well, duh. But can't you at least be happy? We have it? It's about time we had a leg up on the forces we have to face. Don't forget, Chesney, we're up against someone who's not only likely mastered all these spirits, but they've got all this crazy Reagan technology, too. Yeah, but don't you ever think that maybe we shouldn't have either?
She threw up her hands.
Maybe, but what does that matter? They're here. Now, we have to live with that.
She did have a point. It was probably pointless to think about what-ifs and why not. Still, he would love to know why the Reagans had come here, pulled Lennis into a golden age, and then disappeared, leaving it all behind.
Actually, now that I bring that up, I had a question. Revered Master,
Midia said, looking at the sagely old being.
Please? I live to answer. There's a spirit that I have where I don't know where I got it. Earth. Do you know where someone could have learned that spirit?
The old being stroked the ancient greenish-gray skin on his chin.
Well, I believe that spirit is no longer able to be learned on Lennis.
This stunned them both. Midia leaned forward, asking with wide eyes.
Wait, what do you mean by that? How is that possible? Just as I said, the teachers for Earth are no longer on Lennis. They have all passed on, and their techniques and equipment are gone too.
Her face screwed up in confusion.
Then, how do I have it?
He smiled.
Simple, young master. You were born with it. But I was born with light, not earth.
He nodded sagely.
It is very rare, but not unheard of, for a person to be born with a second spirit. However, Earth is very rare. It's been gone from Lennis for many thousands of years. Also, it is not always easy to detect in a person. How often does curing poison come up? Many spiritualists of Earth only discover their talent when it is paired with another.
Her eyes moved about the room like she was locked in an internal discussion with herself. Eventually, she said,
Well, I guess I never considered I may have just been born with it. Is this because of my...
She started to say, but then warily cut herself off, and shook her head.
Well, doesn't matter. Thank you for answering my question.
Now Chesney was curious.
Actually, I have a question too. If Earth is no longer present on Lennis, are there any other unobtainable spirits?
The old man closed his eyes and thought, then nodded.
Yes. Earth, fire, and heart, I believe. None of these remain to be taught.
Hearing that was like a physical blow. It had never occurred to him that he could never gain access to all of them. Eventually, it seemed hypocritical of him to lament the loss of the possibility after his initial worries about power, but he couldn't help it. It was almost as if the very spirits inside him cried out in anguish as well. Without meaning to, a single tear rolled down his cheek.
Well now, do we have any other questions, young masters?
Chesney probably should have inquired again about why the spirits only worked in pairs, but his mood had soured.
No, thank you. I appreciate everything, master.
He stood and bowed. Midia mirrored him, and they left after paying the fee.
Oh, I forgot to ask, Midia, what does air and earth do?
She smirked.
Oh, it's really cool. I'll show you when I have the chance. It will be a fun surprise. I do like surprises.
He was about to bring the conversation back to their next steps, when he noticed something. Aside from the smell of wet grass and sweet flowers in the moist air, he noticed the smell of something delicious.
What on Linus is that amazing smell?
Fastjo and Medea sniffed as well.
Oh, I have no idea, but I need it.
Medea sighed. After a moment, Fastjo said,
Oh, do you recall? I mentioned the amazing bakery that was in Masudo. I do believe this is the smell of Joyce's bakery. She is beloved by everyone for her amazing food. Oh, can we try to get some? Please.
Medea practically begged. Chesney shrugged. He had nothing against going, but it was going to be especially disappointing if they were turned away again.
Sure, but let's at least try to look like we belong.
They put up their helmets and hoods, and put Fastjo in front. They walked towards the door as casually as possible. The bakery had a sign, Joyce's Bakery, decorated with flowers and loaves of bread. There was a wide window in the front that displayed all kinds of baked goods. Most of them were different kinds of loaves, but there was even some small cakes. The smell out front was intoxicating. Chesney could have sworn that a shadow moved behind a tree as they walked in the door, but he didn't mention it. It was really quite misty outside, and it could have been anything. A sweet woman's voice rang out from a back room.
I'll be right with you. Have a look around.
So, they did. Chesney's mouth was watering just imagining some toast with butter and jam on some of these thick slices of bread. Medea was like everywhere at once, giggling about what she wanted to try first. Chesney quietly checked his pouch. Not able to buy any new weapon or armor upgrades. They were absolutely full. If possible, this would be a worthy place to splurge. Walking briskly out of the back came a petite but toned Fiorla woman with a pink forehead plate and pointed ears, hauling a tray of buns.
Woo! Sorry about that. Care for a sample?
Her smile was incredibly warm and genuine, even when it seemed she was under strain trying to carry the whole tray.
Yes, please,
Medea said, eyes wide.
Here you go, kids. You too, sir,
the woman said, dusting flour off her hands and handing them each one of the buns. Chesney bit into it and was lost for a long moment in the absolute joy of eating freshly baked food.
These are to die for, miss.
Medea could only swoon as soon as she started eating. The baker smiled knowingly, and said,
Well, I'm glad my food is a hit with the Nasquat kid, too.
Medea coughed in surprise.
I guess you figured us out, huh?
The woman laughed easily.
Haha, don't worry about it. That kind of thing has never concerned me. But, try as you might to disguise yourselves. That smell will always give you away. I'm Joyce, by the way. Pleasure to meet you.
They introduced themselves as well. It was rare to find someone so open and polite here in Sasquatch.
I can't believe it's so strongly noticeable,
Chesney said, looking himself over. Most of his body was covered in thick armor.
Well, I think it's really all in the diet. Nobody notices it where they live, but if you travel a lot, you'll start to notice how people smell like what they eat. If you eat enough food here, I'm sure the smell will go away eventually.
Medea groaned.
How long will that take? I can't say I'd know. Probably a few weeks. Ugh. So, we're going to have to deal with people treating us badly for the whole trip then.
At this, Joyce's face screwed up in thought.
You know, I just thought of something. There's this special kind of grain that's so strongly flavorful that people complain they smell like they've eaten one for weeks afterward. Do you have anything made with it handy?
Chesney asked, hope in his voice. Joyce winced.
Sadly, no. It's not particularly popular, since it's also a bit rare.
She smiled again.
But, I'll tell you what. I know where some is, and if you go and get me some, I'll happily bake it up for you free of charge.
At their enthusiastic nods, she continued.
It's called the Kiowa, and there's a cave just off to the east of here, and then north in a narrow valley where it grows. One thing I'll say though is that there's a lot of immature Kiowa there as well. You can figure out the real one because its color is red, and it's a little less lively than the immature green variety. Lively?
The pair asked with raised eyebrows. She nervously laughed, saying,
Haha, yeah. The immature green type of Kiowa actually moves around and attacks people to keep them away while it matures.
Chesney rubbed his forehead.
I'm starting to see why it's rare to get some in the shop. Oh, I know it sounds hard, but I bet you can do it. Here, take a bit more bread each, and I'll even fill up your bottles for the journey, okay?
Stunned, the pair looked at each other and then at Joyce. Medea gave her a concerned look.
Joyce, are you sure? That's incredibly generous of you. Why are you helping us? Won't people here be mad?
Joyce's face turned a little more somber, and she looked down at the tray of buns she'd just made.
I don't know. I just feel like, I guess, none of this Nasquat and Sasquatch stuff really matters, see? All I care about is getting to share my baking with people. I love to see their faces light up when they take a bite. We are all people. All we want is to live in peace and be happy. And when I see people in trouble, or tired, or hungry, I just feel like I have to help them out if I can. Is that stupid of me? No. Helping people is never stupid,
Medea said, smiling and turning to glance at Chesney as she said it. Something about the way she said it made Chesney flush, and he didn't know where to look.
Well, thank you so much, Joyce. It was great meeting a friendly face here.
Chesney stammered. Joyce returned it with a wide smile.
Anytime.
And then she filled their bottles and gave them another bit of bread to take on their journey. Waving goodbye to each other, the trio made their way out of the shop.
Wow, she was awesome,
Chesney said, breathing out in a big sigh.
Why can't everyone around here be that nice? Right? I think I almost cried when she offered to help us instead of chased us out of her shop.
They were interrupted by a shadow jumping in front of them from a nearby tree, and pointing a shaking finger at him. Oh crap, I wasn't seeing things.
You! What were you doing with my Joyce? Said
the man, who was a man who had to be in his mid-20s. He was strong-looking, but his clothes were a bit plain. Chesney put up his hands.
Whoa, hold on there, guy. I was just shopping. And none of your lies. You keep away from Joyce, you hear?
The man said, somewhere between incensed and scared. To Chesney's amazement, the man dashed forward and tried to throw a punch right at him. Easily he dodged out of the way. Medea gasped in shock when she finally realized what just happened. Fastio slid a cutlass out of his belt in the blink of an eye. He didn't look happy. This doesn't need to get messy. Chesney waved his friends back.
Hold on. Let's not get too crazy.
Turning to the man, he tried to avert the conflict.
Guy, I don't know what you're so mad about, but I swear Joyce is fine. Let's just calm hey.
The man ignored his pleas and tried to tackle him to the ground. Not wanting to get pinned by the much larger man, Chesney punched him in the face and pushed him off. He could end the fight right now with a quick bolt of lightning or a flash of fire, but that would draw a lot of attention. Using Cormu's sword here seemed like overkill, so he'd go a little more subtle. Taking the power of sky and sphere, he filled his fist with magic enough to crumble the man's defenses. With a solid blow, he slammed into the man's gut, which doubled him over and he was left coughing, kneeling on the ground.
There. Can we stop now?
Eventually, the man regained his breath and his footing, and pointed a much less confident finger in Chesney's direction.
Let's call this a draw. Durin won't forget this. Next time, I'll get you.
He stammered, then turned and ran. A few silent beats passed.
What in the world was that about?
Chesney exclaimed, gesturing incredulously. Medea smirked.
Looks like Joyce has, quite, The secret admirer. Good job not hurting him, though. Oh yes, super secret. He's lucky I didn't turn him into a flame-broiled meat skewer.
He had tried really hard not to hurt him though, almost completely on instinct. When did that start happening? It felt like not long ago. He would have overreacted and tried to fight for his life, but when the man started attacking him, he wasn't worried in the least. Maybe that was it. He knew instantly the man wasn't really a threat, and maybe it was a little silly to feel proud about not hurting someone when he could have, but it reminded him that maybe he didn't need to feel so on edge all the time. After they left, they made their way east, then north to find the cave in which the Kiowa was said to grow. The mists of the region never abated at all, and once again they were forced to use the map often to keep their bearings. The sounds of their passage were swallowed up by the mists as well, making the journey eerily quiet. When they started north, they found the path was quite narrow, and overgrown with vegetation. It seemed everywhere they stepped, they disturbed some animal's burrow, and the grasses around them constantly flitted with darting forms and unseen rustlings. Soon, though, they came to what seemed to be an end to the path.
That's odd,
Midia remarked, looking at the map.
The cave should be just past here, but there doesn't seem to be a way around. Is it a boulder? Maybe it fell down from one of the mountains.
Chesney thought out loud, while getting closer and examining the obstruction. Midia giggled with glee.
Aha! This is a perfect opportunity to show you that new spell I learned. Just watch me.
The two men watched her as she stepped in front of the boulder, and brought her hands together. A strange breeze seemed to come from nowhere from below, and her long purple hair began to sway and curl.
By the spirits of earth and air. Berry.
The ground erupted into a bubbling, churning mass in front of her. Soil flowed like water. The air was filled with the scent of freshly overturned earth and decaying plant matter, as a wider and wider area of soil began to bubble and heave. At last, the boulder was caught up in the tumult, and rocked about like a small boat braving the waves in a stormy sea. Slowly, it began to sink lower, and lower under the dirt. Midia began to pant and waver.
HGAJ. This is a lot harder than I expected. I thought I was stronger than this. Pace yourself,
Chesney called over the terrific rumbling.
That blow-up spell of mine takes a huge toll too. You need to give your body time to get used to the sudden strain.
Her forehead glistened with sweat, and she had to close her eyes to concentrate.
I can do this,
she said through gritted teeth. It was when he saw her suddenly grow pale that Chesney ran to her side. He managed to catch her just as she collapsed.
Midia,
he cried, cradling her.
Take deep breaths.
She tried. He fumbled at his belt for a dose of ibuprofen.
Hold on now, take it easy. You'll be fine in just a second,
he said, his voice set to a practiced calm. He dropped the bottle, spilling the contents all through the brush. One stuck out. He picked it up and wiped it off, putting it to her lips. Her mouth opened and took it, and a second later her flesh grew pinker, and her breathing more even.
Idiot. Don't waste those on something like this,
she chided, though she looked grateful nonetheless, if not a bit more red than usual.
I would have been fine in a minute.
He breathed a sigh of relief and began to pop the rest of the spilled medicine he could find into the bottle. He was sure he missed a few, but he couldn't reach any farther with Midia still resting on him.
Oh, shut up. I was just worried, okay?
It was easy to forget that she was still just a kid too. She'd fought so hard in so many battles with him, he almost thought of her as a force of nature. But then moments like this one would remind him that magic was still a big danger to their lives they couldn't take lightly. It had taken him a long time to come to grips with using the biggest draining spells, and using it twice in a row while under fire was nothing short of miraculous. It seems Midia had just gotten her first taste of one of those deeply costly spells.
You two need to run over to me right now,
Fast Joe shouted, unsheathing his cutlass. Confusedly, the pair of them swiveled their necks this way and that while trying to stand, searching for whatever danger Fast Joe seemed to have seen. That was when the boulder started to move. Then, a snarling, lizard-like head on a long neck emerged from the mist above the boulder. The two of them scrambled to their feet and ran back away from it. What they had thought to be a boulder was in fact the backside of an enormous creature. As it slowly pulled itself out of the ground, what emerged was almost like a small dragon. A massive, trunk-like body covered in bronze-colored scales supported by 3 sets of stumpy legs. Rising impossibly tall above it was an incredibly long and thick neck. The head had a long nose and jaw, expressive angry orange eyes, a crown of red spikes. Black spittle dripped from a jaw filled with rows of jagged teeth. It had a thick scaly tail, just as long as its neck, and just in front of the 3 pairs of legs were a set of slightly smaller arms, with very articulate-looking hands. It looked like it could pick them up and crush them both easily in each hand, and then bite their heads off at its leisure.
What in the world is that thing? It's huge!
Chesney gasped, staring straight up at the towering creature. It was easily just as big as the Terror Rex's had been, but the reach of the creature was incomparable. He wrenched the sword of Cormu out of its sheath and held it trembling in front of him, placing himself between the creature and his friends. Before anyone could react, the creature seemed to heave almost like it was throwing up, and snapped its jaws and made sparks. A second later, the black spittle ignited, and then it breathed forth a jet of flames right at Chesney. He wasn't able to dodge at all and screamed as the flames enveloped him completely.
Chesney!
Medea shouted, catching him as he fell back. She gasped in pain. The armor was too hot to touch. She had no idea what it must be like to wear it. The thought filled her with pity, horror, and dread. Panicking, she found a gap in the armor, pressed her hands to it, and filled him with healing energy from the crown. He sucked in a breath through his teeth. Fast Joe stood in front, cutlass at the ready.
It's a bronza. Stay out of the reach of its hands, or you'll lose your head. And don't use fire either.
Chesney gritted his teeth and flipped to his feet, enduring the pain of his freshly mended skin.
Fast Joe, guard Medea. Medea, buff me up, then pepper him.
Breathless from the sudden shift in circumstances, Medea gasped out a sound meant to be agreement. She lifted her hands and a wave of magic spread out over the trio. Instantly, their movements increased speed. Chesney darted forward, then with the increased speed took full advantage to use some supportive magic of his own while staying on the move. Using his magic, he weakened the material structures of the bronze's skin. Now, all of his sword strikes would pass through much easier. The bronze wasn't interested in him anymore. Now, he was after Medea. Its great head came swooping in from above, trying to grab her completely in its jaws. Shrieking in surprise, she tried to jump out of the way, but, as if anticipating her movement, it rammed right into the dirt and managed to catch her leg. It then pulled her up into the air.
No!
Fast Joe shouted, rushing forward and throwing his sword in a spin up at the monster's face. It lodged deeply in the bronze's flesh right under its eye, but it did not release her. Her leg crushed in its jaws. Medea was unable even to pull herself up without enduring awful pain. Screaming in effort, she landed a bolt of lightning at the blade, hoping the conductivity would be enough to do some real damage. It growled in pain, and she slipped from his jaws. But then, it dove after her, and snapped her leg again, this time getting a better grip above the knee. Blood poured from the wound, and she couldn't help but cry out in agony as her flesh was torn.
Medea! I'm coming!
Chesney roared, his own injuries completely forgotten. He ran towards the beast like a madman, leaping onto it and piercing the flesh between its neck and body with his sword to the hilt. Using the sword like a handhold, he pulled himself up onto the top of the creature, wrenched the sword free, and started stabbing it repeatedly in the back. It roared in pain, the sound of it echoing off the close rock walls and doubling the intensity. Unable to hold on, it dropped her.
I have you,
Fastjo called, dashing underneath her and grabbing her before she fell headfirst into the ground. The long neck of the Bronza spun around, and the head snapped at Chesney, trying to sweep him on its back.
I'm not going anywhere,
he yelled, wrenching his sword free and slashing at the oncoming jaws. Still, it wasn't enough to stop the attack, and the jaws almost closed around his whole torso. But just as they would have locked tight, he seemed to be almost pushed out. The armor? He wondered, though he didn't have time to really think on it. Snarling, the creature again started heaving and snapping its jaws. Making a split-second decision, Chesney gestured with his hands, and a layer of distorted air covered his body just in time for the intense breath attack. Much of the flames passed around him like a water being pushed aside from the stern of a boat, but still, the skin in the gaps of his armor began to throb and burn.
My turn,
he cried, throwing his hand out and sending a powerful wave of reality-breaking distortion right at its head. For a moment, its skin and bones rattled and tore and cracked, and it reeled back in pain and confusion. It looked awful, but still the thing looked ready to fight. The thing seemed intelligent enough to hate, because the look in its eyes as it stared at Chesney staggered him. It then snapped its neck away from him, and started diving towards Midia as she was being propped up by Fastjo.
No,
Chesney cried, cursing himself and running towards them. By staying on its back, he had left them wide open. There was no way he'd reach them before the monster. Midia, pale and shivering, covered in blood, was laying on Fastjo as he tried to put pressure on her wounds as she worked to heal herself. Both of them could see the blow coming and knew they couldn't even stand before the attack came in. Fastjo, weaponless, selflessly used his body to cover Midia as best he could as the shadow of its jaws descended upon them. Midia cursed, and flung something small in her hand up at the creature. A fraction of a second later, the head exploded with a deafening crack. Flesh, bone, and blood rained down on them, and all around them. The loud crack shook the walls of stone, and small rocks and pebbles cascaded down. Lifeless, the neck fell to the ground and a veritable fountain of blood began to pour from it, turning the overgrown path into a red and black swamp. Breathlessly, Chesney ran again to her side, throwing his helmet off. Her leg was completely crushed, broken in several places, and almost a dozen deep puncture wounds seeped dark blood onto the ground, mixing with that of the Bronza. He practically shoved a pill into her mouth.
How on Lennis did you do that?
While he was grabbing another, he was absolutely astonished to see the wounds close instantly, and the bones began to snap back together. The power of this medicine was truly incredible. She screamed again at the violent way in which her body reknitted itself back together, and then covered her eyes to hide the tears. He caught Fastjo in a fierce hug.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You saved her with that catch.
Before Fastjo could even respond, Chesney let him go, lifted her up in his arms.
Talk to me. Are you still hurt? I'm so sorry I didn't keep you safe.
She took a few breaths, and tried to talk, but couldn't. Chesney called to Fastjo, asking for a blanket and some water. He quickly obliged, draping a blanket over her, and gently bringing up a small cup of water. She took it gratefully and cleared her throat.
I'm okay. And it's okay. All that matters now is that I'm safe. I'm okay.
Seemingly unsatisfied, he still looked her over.
What was that thing at the end?
He asked, almost automatically, while he was checking her.
The explosion? Well, after Fastjo caught me, I was worried it might attack again, so I fumbled at my belt and picked out a bomb pellet. And, you can put me down now. It's okay. Oh. Right. Sorry.
Chesney blushed and ran over to the rock wall, setting her down gently. Once he had, he let out a huge sigh of relief and sank to the ground as well. He groaned.
Why is everything here enormous? How do people travel around?
Fastjo, nearby, was trying to pull his sword out of the rock wall where it had been blasted by the explosion.
Well, I'm not sure if you noticed, But everything is connected by rope network stations. There's a reason for that. I'm starting to see the appeal,
Medea said, looking over at the gargantuan beast's body as blood still continued to pour from the neck. Chesney started to pack everything away again.
All right, we're heading back. That was too dangerous. We can try again tomorrow. No, we're not,
Medea argued.
Not only is there nowhere to sleep back in Masudo, but I'm fine. If we went back, we would just be wasting time.
Her body, covered in blood, leg torn to shreds, and broken, having to watch as the head of the Bronza descended down upon their helpless forms, and he knew in his heart he wouldn't reach them in time. Chesney couldn't stop thinking about it all.
Don't be ridiculous. You just survived almost being eaten. There's no way we're going to go into that cave and risk your life again so soon.
Frustrated, Medea tossed the blanket off her and jumped to her feet, glaring at him.
Okay, this whole overprotectiveness thing was sweet for a minute, but now you're getting on my nerves. My life? Since when was my life any of your business? I'm perfectly capable of deciding for myself what I'm capable of.
She picked up her pack, wiped as much blood from herself as she could, and said,
Now stop being so paranoid, and let's just go.
Equally frustrated, he shoved the last few things into his bag, and shouldered it as well.
Fine, and just don't push yourself with that big spell right now, okay?
She rolled her eyes and growled.
I am N.O.T. looking for your advice right now. Stop treating me like you're so much better than me.
What is with this reaction? Can't she see that I'm just worried about her after she was almost torn to shreds? Right in front of me? Without further words, they both stomped off north, in search of the cave that should be nearby. Still trying to get his sword unstuck from the rock wall, Fasco called out,
I'll just catch up, shall I?
The cave was very nearby, just as the map had predicted. The wide cave mouth was filled with animal bones, and it was very likely the den of that Bronza. When they reached the depths of the cave, where light no longer reached, they found the caverns opened up to a whole underground world far, far below them. The paths were narrow, and passage between large rock outcroppings along the way was only available via simple rope bridges. Far below, they could see an entire network of magma pools and rivers. It greatly reminded them of the town of Hagudo, and that whole sprawling system of caves they had barely seen a fraction of Chesney wondered if there were rat-gorn cities under Asquat, just like Gotham cities under Nasquat like Hagudo. Not that they were talking much. Things were quiet and awkward at first, and they barely acknowledged each other. Chesney felt bad that Fascio had to endure this, but for the time being neither of them were in any mood to converse. When they came across a group of tall, thin, greenish-brown stalks in their path, they wondered if they had found what they were looking for. Approaching the plants, they stood in a circle around them.
Well, there's no point in just waiting around. Let's grab them and go,
he said to them. Medea just raised an eyebrow and crossed her arms. Sighing exasperatedly, Chesney said,
Fine. I guess I'll just do it.
He reached down and tried to break the stem at the bottom, when the slightly bulbous top of the plant turned and snapped at him, chomping down on his gloved hand. Then, the rest of the plants there started doing the same and snapping at him. He tried to break free, but when that didn't work, he just blasted them with fire and they crumbled in seconds.
Well, looks like you're not nearly as good at listening as you are at being an overprotective oaf. Joyce said the plants we needed were red, remember? Not green.
He snapped back.
Great. So you just decided to let me be attacked. Incredibly mature. Medea!
That's when the bickering really started. From outcropping to outcropping, and from rope bridge to rope bridge, they sniped at each other back and forth until they were practically shouting. When they were set upon by the local creatures, she would ignore his orders and attack them as she pleased. When she would overextend or get surrounded, Chesney would pretend not to notice, and Fascio would be forced to intervene. At last, the interminably patient Fascio had had enough. After being set upon by a huge field of the vicious juvenile Kiowa plants, with a pair of paralyzing whipper plants beside, and taking far too many wounds than was necessary. He put his foot down and yelled at them both to stop and listen to him.
Okay, this has gone on long enough. Now, I really hate to say this, but both of you are acting like children.
Chesney opened his mouth to say the obvious answer, but was interrupted by Fast Joe, raising his hand and saying,
That is beside the point. Now, both of you,
he said, glaring at them both equally.
You're overreacting, and it needs to stop. Chesney, I understand that you go a little crazy when Medea gets hurt. I don't go crazy.
Fast Joe gestured for silence.
Don't argue. Now, I want you to honestly think about this. Did we really need to go back? We were not remotely short on ibuprofen. We'd barely gone through one bottle, and still had a second one. Not to mention the completely full bottles of paracetamol, and Sophie's crown. Will you admit that you maybe went a little overboard with your unilateral decision to turn back?
When it was all laid out like that, it wasn't hard to see things from Fast Joe's perspective. It had just felt so right at the time, turning back after such an encounter. He saw her almost die, and he just had to make sure she was safe, no matter what. Sighing, he nodded.
Yeah, okay. I get it. And, for what it's worth, I'm sorry I overreacted. Fine. I guess I went a little crazy. Good. You're the leader, Chesney. I know it's not fair, but you need to keep a cool head and make the right decisions even when your emotions are high. But more than that, you also need to really listen to those around you.
Fast Joe nodded, and turned to Medea, who was glowering at him right back, with her arms crossed.
Good. Now, Medea, I understand that you probably get underestimated all the time, and that's not fair. And I also understand that when we get thrust into life-threatening situations, we all react differently.
Her shoulders tensed up, and she looked away.
But can you at least admit that Chesney was right to be concerned, even if he went a little overboard, and you didn't need to explode? And then being petty on top of that, intentionally endangering all of us?
Her cheeks reddened. Fast Joe waited.
Yes, you're right. I didn't need to react like that. I'm sorry. After I was all fixed up, I just felt so. And I can't really put it into words. But, I'm sorry. Good. Don't push yourself. It's okay to take a rest after something like that. You don't need to prove anything to anyone. And, both of you, remember, you two are incredibly powerful, but it means nothing if you're caught off guard. Now, let's work together and find that Kiowa grain, okay?
The two children nodded sullenly, and they all started walking again. Eventually, they did find it. Medea sighed, gesturing in front of her.
Of course, the plant we need not only is at the very farthest part from the entrance, but is also completely protected by a huge field of juvenile plants. What would one of our adventures be if we weren't forced through yet another cave?
Chesney returned, the slight edge of humor in his voice to bridge the gap between them. She smiled wryly.
At the end of this, I think we'll have stepped foot in every single cave on Lennis. Mark my words. I could get a new job as a tour guide.
Putting on a more serious face, and looking out over the densely packed field of plants, she said,
Well, we can't use magic here. We could start a fire. I'm not sure we have many options for getting there.
Chesney pulled out his sword.
Looks like it's the good old-fashioned way. I'll go in solo, and you two hang back for if I get into trouble.
Before he could rush in, Medea tapped him on the shoulder.
Hold on, I have an idea. Let's use freeze together. With two of us, it should get almost all of them.
That's brilliant. I can't believe I keep forgetting about that spell. Maybe he didn't give her enough credit, but he was always so thankful that she was almost always able to see the best path forward in a situation. He smiled.
Great idea. Let's do it.
They both gestured to the field of plant, and shouted,
Freeze!
And twin waves of shimmering air shot away from them, descending on almost a dozen of the plants. while none of them were moving since they weren't close enough yet. Now, many wouldn't even start. Chesney took the chance then to start running through the field to the red Kiowa plant in the back of the outcropping of rock, right next to a drop-off. Every few steps, one of the plants would animate and try to snap at him, but a quick swish of Cormu's sword quelled them instantly. The red Kiowa plant was identical to the others, save that the bulbous top was no longer filled with little sharp thorns, but now seed grains, and it was motionless. He quickly cut it down, shoved it in his pack, and hurried back to the others now that his path was clear. Fastjo beamed.
There. That's the kind of teamwork I love to see from you two.
They reddened and looked down in embarrassment. Midia's eyes then grew wide.
Oh, since you got to run through there, I call getting us out of this cave with that escape spell.
Chesney grew equally excited.
Oh wow, I almost forgot about that. Man, here I was dreading the return trip, but we really don't need to worry about things like that now, do we?
Grinning like wild, Midia cackled.
Ha ha, we'll be eating fresh baked bread in no time.
Spending a minute concentrating, she closed her eyes and held her hands in the air. Her brows furrowed.
Oh wow, this one is. It's a lot. Not as bad as that berry spell, but close.
Chesney was instantly worried, but bit his tongue. A bead of sweat appeared on her forehead.
It's all the rock. The long-distance warp spell can go a farther distance, but it only works out in the air, and still ends up being less intensive.
Fastjo added.
Yes, escape can be a bit of a big drain. We're in no hurry, so take your time.
She nodded, and breathed evenly. Soon, she said.
Okay, everyone gather around me.
A pale blue circle began to glow on the ground, and they hurried into its area. Once they had, large blue rings began to rise from below, forming a cylinder around them. The similarity to the teleportation device Daphne had used was unmistakable. At last she yelled, "Escape!" and snapped her finger. The rings slammed down, and a white light flashed. Chesney had that disconcerting feeling, just like he had experienced in the temple, that he was falling through the world. Instantly, they were stood outside the cave. Midia took 3 big breaths, and then opened her eyes.
How are you feeling?
Chesney asked, looking her over. She nodded, and gave a thumbs up.
A bit dizzy, but I'm already feeling loads better.
He cracked his knuckles.
Okay, my turn.
He took a very similar pose to what Midia used, and called upon air and sky. If he had to put into words what it was like using them together, it was almost like feeling giddy from cheating. Air, that which controls all in between, was happy to use the rule-breaking powers that sky offered. He visualized the entrance to Misuto, and he found he knew the literal exact distance and direction it was in.
Hold on to your hats,
Chesney said, as another pale blue circle appeared beneath them. The other stood next to him. He continued, grinning with joy at the feel of trying something so new.
Because we are outta here.
He snapped his fingers, and in a flash of light, they were in front of Misuto once more. Midia jumped for joy.
Oh, that's so cool. I wonder if we could warp all the way back home. That is a very good question,
he said.
We might want to experiment with that. If this miracle bread manages to do what Joyce said it would, we should be able to take a bit of downtime at the inn after and try.
Once more, they donned their hoods, useless as it was, and stalked past the wary residents of town. Thankfully, that Zaran fellow they'd met outside of Joyce's bakery wasn't around, so they quietly entered.
Hello there, be right out.
Her familiar voice called from the back. Once again, she came strolling in with a tray of loaves, long ones this time, with flour in her hair. When she saw them, she was startled.
Oh my, back so soon? Did you need to turn back?
Pulling the red stalk of Kiowa out of his pack, Chesney said,
Nope, we're just super talented.
Joyce's eyes grew wide.
Oh, you really managed to do it. Wow, that's incredible.
She dusted off her hands and took the stalk.
This is perfect. I'll get this baked up in a jiffy. Just you wait.
Joyce took the Kiowa, shook out the grains with practiced ease, husked the seeds and got down to grinding them down to a fine powder. As she worked, they had a nice conversation of small talk. Soon, the bakery filled once more with the amazing smell of freshly baked bread, though with a keenly unique sour scent mixed in as well. Soon, the loaf was out of the oven, sliced, and served with fresh butter and jam. The taste was indescribable, sweet, salty, and perhaps a little tangy. Chesney had never had anything like it. Fast Joe perked up.
Oh my, this does work fast.
The children looked at him.
What do you mean?
He shrugged.
I expected perhaps that wet gubo smell to be diminished somewhat, but I can't smell a whiff of it. Just incredible. What do we smell like now?
Medea asked, giving herself a test sniff. She couldn't really detect a difference, but that wasn't terribly surprising.
Well, I wouldn't say you have no smell now, but it's just a familiar one. Like walking into your own house, you notice the air is different, but can't quite name anything specific.
Joyce grinned.
Hey, see? What did I tell you?
Chesney also couldn't help but try for a test sniff, though he wrinkled his nose. He really needed a bath.
Well, if Fastro says so, I believe him. I suppose the real test will be trying to talk to the innkeeper later.
Joyce tilted her head and thought.
So, now that you should have an easier time, what are you planning on doing now?
Chesney considered all sorts of lies, but something about how she had helped them made him feel like he could trust her enough with some of the basic details.
Well, go get some sleep, then take the rope network out east. We're working our way to the east coast.
She furrowed her brow, clearly thinking hard and trying to remember something.
Wasn't there some news about the east the other day? What was it?
Finally, she snapped her fingers.
Aha! That was it. I've heard that there's some kind of resistance base somewhere east of here. You all should be really careful if you go out that way. Who knows what could happen? I'd hate for you to get caught up in all that fighting nastiness. Oh, don't worry. We're really good at staying out of trouble,
Medea said, lying with a big smile on her face. Chesney practically choked trying to hide his reaction. Shortly thereafter, they left the bakery, intending to try once more at the inn. Glancing to the side, Chesney grimaced, spying a familiar skulking figure who was watching the bakery from behind a tree.
Not this guy again.
They quickly pulled up their hoods and pretended to not see him, but the man, ARan, approached them anyway.
Say, do I know you?
Flabbergasted, Medea and Chesney looked at each other, then at ARan. Medea said,
Yes? Maybe?
ARan squinted, then shook his head.
Oh really? Sorry, I don't remember you at all. Anyway, that's not important right now. You were all in the bakery just now, right? Did you happen to hear if Joyce has a bee-boyfriend? What?
Chesney replied, completely amazed that not only did the man not recognize the boy who beat him up with a single punch, but that he was asking them such a question. ARan held his head in his hands.
Sorry, I know that's such a random question. I'm just so in love with her, but I have no idea what to do about it. I'm such a scaredy rat, I can't even bring myself to go into her bakery and talk.
Medea, though, had very little sympathy. Lazily, she explained,
Well, I can honestly tell you that if a guy was interested in me and didn't even have the courage to talk to me about it, I wouldn't give him the time of day. Nobody needs a guy like that. If you want her to notice you, you've got to be brave and be noticed.
He reacted like he was not expecting a reply like that.
Well, you sure don't pull any punches, do you, lady? But I guess I never really thought about it like that. You're right, being a coward isn't going to win me anything.
He seemed to be hyping himself up.
Yeah. If I want her to notice me, I've got to do it myself. Tomorrow, first thing, I'll march in there and tell her how I feel. Thanks, miss.
Afterwards, he turned away, talking to himself.
Okay, How in the world did he not recognize us?
Chetsney asked. Medea shook her head.
Maybe that whole smell thing really was the only thing holding us back. Frankly, I'm just as amazed as you two.
Fastjo chimed in.
My best guess is that the mist may have been a factor as well.
To their delight, the rest of the townsfolk seemed completely oblivious to their origins now. They were able to shop, speak to the locals about various rumors, and get a proper set of beds at the inn. Medea picked up a bit of new armor and boots to replace the very worn-out set she'd been wearing. It didn't hurt that they'd been torn up and patched up more times than she cared to count. That night, at the inn, the trio got to spend some time really cleaning themselves after the many days of travel through the caves and wilderness that had seen them get to Masuta. Since the trip back from the East Cave had taken no time at all, they were able to spend the evening luxuriating in baths and comfortable pajamas, and even relax enough to read or do other personal recreation. The decided trying to see how far the warp spell could go could wait for another day. Chetsney was happy to see his friends get some downtime after so many days of journeying, especially Medea, who had been so on edge. Well, they both had been. The revelation of their heritage as Reagans, great ones, was still fresh. The less he thought about it, the better. Every time he did, he got that sickening lurch in his stomach that his body wasn't his own, and he had to spend a few breaths just finding himself again. He wondered how much trouble Medea had been having with her own issues. When he thought of that, he was reminded of how they'd blown up at each other earlier. That was so odd for them. Evidently, the journeying had been having a harsher toll than he had been willing to admit. Thinking back, he tried to understand just what had made him react the way he had. When he had seen Medea being dragged up in the air, ready to be eaten, he'd lost all sense of reason. No price would have been too high to pay to save her. But then, after all was said and done and she was healed, why had he still been acting like she was still in danger? The passing of hours had cooled his hot head, and now he just felt so strangely about how he had acted. He resolved to apologize, properly this time. When he was finished with his bath, he found her laying on her bed next to a lamp, reading the Duskfall novel he had gotten her.
Hey, can we talk for a sec?
He asked. As Fastjo went to go get his bath, Medea closed up her book and sat up.
Sure. What's wrong? Oh, I was thinking about today, and I felt really bad for how I overreacted. I wanted to really apologize.
She rubbed her forehead, her own features twisting into regret.
Yeah, I'm not exactly blameless in this either.
A silent few heartbeats passed between them. Medea's face showed an unfamiliar expression, and she asked,
Can I ask maybe, why you acted like you did?
He knew the question was coming, and he didn't even really have an answer for himself, let alone for her.
I wish I could really explain it. I don't know, saw you in danger and lost all sense. All I can really articulate is that it was like my body was physically rejecting the idea that you could get hurt and die. Like I absolutely could not allow that to happen, no matter what, and I'd do anything to make sure.
She bit her lip and looked away.
I don't know. I think that's a, pretty normal thing to feel. Maybe, but I'll try to not let myself go quite so crazy,
he said, doing that thing where he scratched his own head for lack of anything to do with his hands.
And, how are you doing? I've been almost eaten once. It was... Well, want to talk about it?
Medea's face changed again to regret.
It's just, I was like, today, I felt so strong. I got new magic, and it felt like I could take on anything. And then, in the blink of an eye, I was caught and helpless.
She wrapped her arms around her legs and balled her hands into fists.
Weak. I felt so weak in that moment. I can't stand it, that feeling. I've pushed myself so hard for my whole life to not feel weak, to feel strong and in control. And, in that moment, it was like none of my will mattered.
A big part of him wanted to put his arm around her to reassure her, but at the same time, he wasn't sure how that reassurance would interact with her feelings of weakness. He decided on a more subtle approach.
Well, if it means anything to you, I think you're the strongest person I've ever met, including me.
Their eyes locked for just a moment when he said it, before they both turned red and glanced away. She smiled.
I really appreciate that you think that, Chesney. Just, this whole thing with our blood, and then this attack. Both of them were moments where I felt like I wasn't in control anymore, and I lashed out. And I hurt you by doing that. That's really not okay, and I'm sorry too, okay?
He smiled, and said,
No problem. And, even if you forget again, I'll remind you you're a badass.
She giggled.
Thanks, lunkhead. What the, hey, you know, you're awfully mouthy for a girl who's as ticklish as you are,
he said, extending a single finger. Her expression changed to mock horror, and she gripped her book like a club.
No, no, no. Don't you dare. I will end you.
They spent some time running around the room like foolish children, until the innkeeper came around and warned them to be quiet. Red-faced and panting, they sheepishly agreed. To Midia's delight, Chesney asked to borrow the Dawnbringer book she'd brought along at the very beginning of the journey, and she evidently had been waiting for just that to happen because she began to absolutely gush about the book, and had to keep herself from mentioning spoilers constantly. Far from helping him relax and get to sleep, he found himself to be completely enraptured in the book, and struggled to put it down for the night when it was getting late. It was so a foreign feeling to get lost in something like that. He'd spent the whole journey utterly focused on what to do next that taking time away from that had at times felt impossible. But lately, it was like his mind was suddenly needing that break, and he was all too happy to find a way to push the worries of today off for just a little longer. So, it was with baggy eyes and a genuine smile that he greeted the next morning, and they set out once more. Midia peppered him with questions about how far he was, and what he thought so far all the way during the walk to the rope network just outside of town. The attendants didn't even bat an eye at their presence, and it was mere moments until they were packed in like sardines into another cabin dangling beneath a rope that began to carry them over the mountains to the east. Midia looked out at the scenery below, and said,
You know, Fastjo, I'm starting to understand what you see in the beauty of this place. Once you get used to the somberness, it's easy to get lost in the serene beauty. I just wish the people here were a bit less intense. One of the people we talked to yesterday was just so happy that Nuoi Grin would soon be finished, and Nasquat taken out in a single strike. Who looks forward to something like that?
Playing a rhythm on his knee, Fastjo replied.
Well, Sasquatch is a dangerous land. As such, the people here have adapted to the environment. Zagos conquered the land and united it. What are conquerors to do but conquer more? By giving the people of Sasquatch something to focus on, they'll forget the bitterness of their own lives, just for a while. That's such a short-sighted opinion, though,
Chesney added, looking out over the mountains and valleys, and missing the blazing sun of Nasquat.
What happens when he's finished wiping out all his enemies? There's no way he wouldn't just turn around and oppress his own people even more. And at that point, there's nobody left who would fight for them.
Fastjo raised his eyebrows.
And yet, here we are.
The car had just breached the banks of mist enveloping the valley of Masudo, and they began to crest the easternmost mountain. The cables of the network ran all the way down into a new valley, up again, and out of sight.
So, what's the next town, Fastjo?
Midia asked, turning to face their companion now that the scenery seemed to be repeating itself. The minstrel performer stroked his mustache and thought.
You know, come to think of it, I'm not too sure. There might be a few towns out this way. Conchudo, and... what was the other one? Bah, I can't remember.
Suddenly, there was explosion all around them right as they passed under another of the rope support structures. The car jerked violently in the air, and the rope snapped. With hardly a moment to scream, they fell to the ground in a rush amidst the sound of more blasts and screeching metal. With a horrible crack they hit the ground, and the car blew apart into scrap. Each of them was tossed through the air with bits of rope, glass, and torn metal shrapnel falling upon them like rain. The explosion and fall made Chesney's consciousness fade in and out. He couldn't feel his body or make much sense of anything, but he was dimly aware of shouting or cheering. He tried to move to look up as he heard a set of footsteps approach, but the thought of moving might as well have been the shrugging off an ocean. Just before he blacked out, he heard a woman's voice.
Wait a second. These are just kids.
Followed by a good deal of cursing.